Dead men don't balance ledgers, and fools don't survive the waterfront after dark. Sasha Birch had always known the first truth from 11 months of making numbers disappear into offshore columns. She was learning the second one right now, crouched behind a rusted electrical panel in sub-level 2 of the Harbourfront Trade Center parkade, listening to footsteps echo off the concrete. 3 men, she'd counted their voices, 2 on the lower ramp, 1 sweeping the rows with a torch. Her knees ached against the cold floor. Her blazer was thin, a wool blend from a consignment shop on Commercial Drive, and it offered approximately nothing against the January damp that crept off the water. She'd come back for her laptop bag, a stupid, catastrophically stupid decision, after realizing she'd left it under her desk when the elevator doors had already closed. She'd been in the stairwell when she heard them come into the main floor. When she'd pressed herself against the fire door and peered through the scratched safety glass, she'd seen 2 men she didn't recognize dragging a third toward the loading bay. The third man was Oscar, the night shift security guard who brought her tea when she worked late. He had a daughter in Kelowna. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't moved. She had pressed her back against the painted cinder block and counted her heartbeats until the sounds from the loading bay stopped. Then she had gone down instead of up, and now she was here in the sub-level, with her phone pressed flat against her thigh so the screen's glow wouldn't give her away. The torch beam swept past the row of support columns, 12 meters, maybe 10. Sasha opened her contacts. She had her sister in Abbotsford. She had her landlord. She had her dentist, who also happened to be her landlord's cousin, which was a level of small-world networking she'd never fully processed, and she had him. 1 entry, no first name, no title, just Soren, sitting between a dry cleaner and a staffing agency she'd used 2 years ago. She had never called it. She pressed the number before the rational part of her brain could file an objection. 3 rings. She counted them the way she counted everything, calmly, mechanically, as though the number meant something. Yes, the voice on the other end was low and flat, not groggy, not irritated, just present in the way that a locked door is present. Mr. Soren. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. It's Birch, from accounts. 15 floors above the Harbourfront parkade, in a private room at the Vancouver club, Jasper Soren set his glass of scotch down on the white tablecloth without making a sound. Across from him, 2 men from the Bellamy outfit were in the middle of renegotiating terms on the Tsavassen route. They had been talking for 40 minutes. One of them had a nervous habit of tapping his signet ring against the table every time he lied, which was often. Soren had found it mildly useful. His phone was face down beside his bread plate. Only 4 people had this number. 2 were in the room. One was his lawyer, who billed in 15-minute increments and only called when there was a warrant. The 4th was his accounts manager, who had been with the company for 11 months and had never, in 11 months, called outside of business hours. He picked up the phone. She said her name like she was correcting a clerical error, like it was information he might need for his records. "Where are you?" He didn't make it a question. Questions took too long. Across the table, one of the Bellamy men frowned. "Sub-level parkade, Harbourfront Trade Center. There are 3 men. I don't recognize them. They came in from the loading bay. The security guard, Oscar, I think he's, a pause, controlled, tight." She was managing her breath the way people did when they were terrified and refusing to show it. "Mr. Soren, they're sweeping the floor. I have maybe 4 minutes. Soren stood up. The legs of his chair made no sound on the carpet. One of the Bellamy men started to say something about Eastern terminal rates. "We'll reschedule," Soren said. He was already moving toward the coat check. His associate, a compact and watchful man named Grady, fell into step beside him without being asked. Grady had been with Soren for 9 years. He understood the geometry of Soren's silences. "Who's in the parkade?" Grady murmured as they stepped into the marble foyer. "Birch." Grady said nothing. He was already on his phone. Out on Georgia Street, the January rain was a curtain of fine grey mist, Soren's car was in the club's bay. He didn't wait for the valet. He took the keys off the hook himself and had the car moving before Grady had fully closed the passenger door. 3 unknowns, Soren said, cutting left onto Burrard. Bellamy men, almost certainly. They were at the building. They weren't supposed to know about the building. Grady's voice was neutral. Evidently, Soren drove with one hand, the other holding his phone low against the steering wheel. The call timer was still running. 58 seconds. 59. He could hear her breathing through the speaker. She had gone completely silent. No voice, just the controlled in and out of someone who had locked themselves very still. And underneath it, the distant scrape of a torch beam against concrete and the echo of boots. He kept the line open. He drove. There was a sound like a step closer. Then a voice, a man's voice, saying something low and almost conversational. The kind of voice that didn't need to be loud because it already knew it had won. Soren pressed the accelerator to the floor. He had hired her because the candidate before her had tried to negotiate a signing bonus, which he found presumptuous, and the one before that had flinched when 2 of his men walked through the office carrying a duffel bag. Birch had been the 3rd candidate of the afternoon. She'd arrived 7 minutes early. Her resume had no gaps, no padding, and one line at the bottom that read, simply, Forensic Accounting Certification in progress. She'd looked at the papers he slid across the desk, the ones designed to be vaguely alarming to civilian sensibilities, and sorted them into 3 piles, labeled by category, and asked whether the company used accrual or cash basis accounting. He'd hired her within the hour. In 11 months, she had reorganized his entire payroll structure, found an embezzlement scheme that 2 previous accountants had missed or ignored, and implemented a filing system so logical that even Grady used it voluntarily. She did not ask what was in the secured freight containers. She did not comment on the men who came and went at odd hours. She brought her own lunch, worked until 6 o'clock precisely, and then put on her coat and left, and the office was measurably less organized in her absence. He had not thought about her outside of those parameters. He had been deliberate about that. The Harborfront Trade Center was 12 blocks south, flanked by the inlet and a string of logistics warehouses that Soren had been gradually acquiring for 6 years. He pulled into the service entrance on the north side, tires hissing against wet asphalt, and was through the utility corridor and down the stairwell before Grady had finished his 2nd phone call. Sub-level 2, fluorescent lighting replaced by emergency backup strips, everything cast in a thin bluish pallor. 3 men, 2 near the support columns, 1 crouching beside a car on the east wall with a torch. He saw her before they did, behind the electrical panel, standing completely still, her spine against the wall, her chin lifted, her dark hair loose around her face. She was watching the torch with the calm, fixed attention of someone doing a very dangerous kind of maths. She was the only still thing in the parkade. What happened next was brief and not particularly pleasant, and took approximately 90 seconds. When it was finished, all 3 men were on the floor, and Soren walked to the electrical panel. She was still there, both hands pressed flat to the metal at her sides, like she'd been bracing for impact. She looked at the men on the floor, then at him. Her expression did not shift into relief. That surprised him. What it shifted into was something more guarded, the look of someone recalculating. "Birch," he said. Mr. Sorely steady. "Oscar, the security guard, loading bay. My men are dealing with it." A pause, beaten but alive. Something moved through her face, a quick, sharp thing she controlled almost instantly, not weakness. Just humanity, surfacing through the armor. She nodded once, businesslike. She bent down, picked up her laptop bag from where she'd wedged it behind the panel's base, straightened, and looked at him with the expression she normally wore when delivering quarterly reports. "I assume," she said, "that those men being here means someone told them where to find this building." "Yes," Soren said. "And that this isn't over." "No," Soren said, "it isn't." She slung the bag over her shoulder. "Then where are we going?" She did not cry in the car. She did not shake or press herself against the door, or make any of the sounds that people made when the adrenaline collapsed. She sat in the back seat with her laptop bag across her knees and watched Vancouver move past them, the wet neon of Granville, the long dark stretch of the Cambie Bridge, with the focused quiet of someone taking inventory. Grady rode up front. He didn't speak, neither did she. Soren's building was in Yaletown, 11 floors, parking secured below grade. The penthouse occupied the top floor. Birch walked out of the private elevator and looked at it the way she looked at everything, calmly, noting details. It was not a warm space. It was precise. Clean lines, dark materials, nothing that didn't serve a function. The windows were floor-to-ceiling and bulletproof, which she likely didn't know and didn't need to. Guest room, Soren said. Second door. There are clothes in the dresser. She turned to look at him. My apartment, she said, is compromised. They know where you work. They know your name. By morning, they'll know everything else. A pause, a very controlled pause. I have a cat, she said. He looked at her. There's a neighbor with a key, she said. I need to call her. Call her. Tell her nothing about tonight. Tell her you're traveling for work. She held his gaze for a moment longer, measuring something. Then she took out her phone and walked down the hall. Grady appeared at Soren's shoulder. Peterson's crew picked up 2 more Bellamy men at the loading bay entrance. They weren't talking yet. They will, Soren said. The Bellamys are going to move fast. They know they've been made. Yes. Soren turned toward the windows. The city lay below, its lights fractured in the rain. Pull Chen and Ibarra off the eastern rotation. I want them here by 6. The penthouse was very quiet for a moment. Soren stood at the window. He had not thought about Birch outside of the office. He'd been specific about that, because the alternative was sentiment, and sentiment got people killed. But he could still hear the particular quality of her breathing through the phone. The way she'd managed it, counted it almost, in that freezing parkade, while a man swept a torch 10 meters away. She had called him, not emergency services, not her sister, him. He didn't know what to do with that, so he filed it where he filed most things that didn't have an immediate use, and he went to make coffee. By 7 in the morning, the penthouse had been converted into an operations room. 4 of Soren's senior people occupied the dining table, now covered in city maps, printed property assessments, and 3 laptops running simultaneous feeds. Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who ran dock security, was cross-referencing Bellamy movement patterns with a cup of black coffee and the expression of someone doing pleasant arithmetic. Birch came down the hall at 7:15, borrowed clothes, dark jeans, grey pullover, hair pulled back. She had her laptop bag. Everyone at the table looked at her. She looked at the maps, then the laptops. She pulled out a chair and sat down. I need the Bellamy Group's last 6 months of publicly filed corporate documents, she said, opening her laptop. Also their insurance carrier, if anyone has it. Grady looked at Soren. Soren was leaning against the counter, watching her. He said nothing. The insurance carrier, Birch said, more patiently, will tell me which assets they've underwritten. Underwritten assets are real assets. Real assets are where the actual capital is. If you want to understand how the Bellamy operation is structured, you start with what they're protecting. Silence. She's right, Chen said slowly. I know, Soren said. Birch looked up, met his eyes briefly, then looked back at her screen. Someone make coffee. There's a French press on the counter. It's not complicated. Grady made the coffee. It took her 40 minutes. Soren watched her work, the way her fingers moved across the keyboard with rapid, unhesitating precision, the way she built her case quietly, methodically, from the ground up. She cross-referenced 3 databases, 2 of which she accessed through channels he suspected were not strictly above board, but which he found he had no objections to. There, she said. She turned the laptop to face the table. The Bellamy Group's holding company has been quietly acquiring warehouse space along the Clark Drive corridor for the past 8 months. 6 units, all listed as inactive storage. But the property tax filings show active utility consumption at 4 of the 6 sites. She pointed to a line of figures. The consumption pattern matches operational use. Cold storage, most likely, which means pharmaceutical transit. They're running a secondary route parallel to yours through the interior. That's what last night was about. They weren't sending a message. They were trying to remove a witness to a route map they don't want you to have. The table was quiet. They've been moving product up the Clark corridor for at least 6 months, Birch continued, which means they have a contact inside the Port Authority, because that routing shouldn't have been invisible to your network. Someone is being paid to look elsewhere. Soren straightened. He looked at Grady. Ibarra has a list of Port Authority contacts. Cross-reference it against Bellamy's payroll disclosures from the last fiscal year. Already pulling it, Ibarra said, leaning toward his laptop. Birch turned back to her screen. She reached over and took the coffee that someone had set beside her elbow, without looking, without thanking, the automatic reflex of someone who had spent years working at a desk while the world moved around her. Soren watched the small, precise motion of her hand around the cup. He filed that too. The confirmation came in the early afternoon. A name, a mid-level Port Authority assessor who had been quietly supplementing his salary for 7 months. The Bellamy's operational hub was the 3rd warehouse on the Clark corridor, the largest of the 6 units. They'll expect retaliation at the docks, Birch said, not looking up. She had not moved in 4 hours. That's the obvious target. They'll be concentrated there. We know, Grady said. So don't go to the docks, she said. Go to the warehouse, the 3rd one. She turned the laptop around again. A satellite image, overlaid with utility lines. The eastern wall shares a foundation with a decommissioned cold storage unit from a meat processor that went under in 2019. The records are public. The Bellamys haven't filed any renovation permits for that wall, which means it's the original construction, poured concrete, 40 years old. It'll be the weakest point in the building. Chen looked at the image. She's right. I know, Soren said. Birch looked at him. There was something almost exasperated in it. Are you going? Yes. Then I need an open comm line. She had already reached for a spare earpiece from Grady's kit on the table, apparently having decided the question was settled. I can monitor the utility feeds and the surrounding street cameras. The city grid has a maintenance access portal that... She paused, seeming to remember who she was speaking to. I can access. I'll watch the perimeter. Soren studied her for a long moment. She met his gaze without flinching, without making it a challenge either, just stating a fact. Fine, he said. The operation took 40 minutes. Soren did not tell her the details of what happened inside the Clark corridor warehouse. He didn't need to. She could read it in the comm chatter, the controlled, clipped language of people managing a serious situation. And she managed it the way she managed everything, by staying focused, by watching her screens, by calling out a secondary vehicle approaching from the north on Terminal Avenue 17 seconds before it would have been visible to the team on the ground. When it was over and the line went quiet, she sat in the silence of the penthouse for a long moment with both hands flat on the table. Soren, she said into the comm. A pause then, here. She closed her eyes, let out one slow breath through her nose, the first uncontrolled breath she had taken in approximately 14 hours. Okay, she said. He came back alone. The penthouse was very quiet when the elevator opened. He looked like a man who had been carrying a significant weight for a very long time and had simply stopped pretending otherwise. There was dust on his jacket. His knuckles were split. She had a clean cloth ready. She didn't make anything ceremonial of it. She walked to him, took his hand, and cleaned the cuts with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of someone raised in a household where medical supplies were shared between 4 people and sentiment was a luxury. He let her. You're going to need to tell me, she said, not looking up from his hand, what the actual scope of this organization is, if I'm going to continue handling the accounts. He was quiet for a moment. You know what it is, he said. I know what it does, she said. I don't know what it's building toward. That affects the financial architecture. It affects what I protect and what I expose. She looked up. His eyes, up close, were darker than they appeared from across a boardroom. There was something in them she didn't have a column for, something that didn't sort neatly. You could leave, he said. It wasn't an offer. It was a statement of fact delivered with the careful precision of a man very aware of all the implications attached to it. I could, she agreed. My apartment is presumably still standing. I could call my sister. I could go back to doing legitimate forensic work for firms that don't have secured freight containers. She looked down at his hand. But I'd be very bored. The corner of his mouth moved. It was small, and it was brief, and it was the first unguarded thing she had seen from him. My organization, he said, is in the process of transitioning a significant portion of its operations toward legalized commercial infrastructure. Shipping, warehousing, port logistics. The underlying network is the same. The paperwork is becoming cleaner. How clean? That depends considerably, he said, on the quality of the accounting. She looked at him. She was aware that this was a threshold, that on the other side of it, the line between what she had been and what she was going to be would not reconstitute itself. She was also aware, and this was the part that surprised her most, that she wasn't afraid of that. She was tired of being afraid of things. She was tired of a life that fit neatly inside a folder. Want a proper contract, she said, and a raise. Obviously, he said. She set the cloth down. She did not step back, and neither did he, and the space between them had the quality of a calculation that had been running for 11 months, finally arriving at its answer. He did not kiss her in a way that asked permission, exactly, but he gave her a full second's warning, a pause, a shift of weight that was invitation enough. She closed the distance herself. 6 months later, on a Tuesday in late July, the Soren Group signed a partnership agreement with the Vancouver Port Authority for the development of 3 new commercial terminals along the South Inlet. The journalists who covered the announcement used words like ambitious and forward-thinking and quietly positioned. Sasha Birch had drafted the press release. She had also drafted the underlying agreements, the holding company restructure, and the 4 subsidiary contracts that attached to the terminal deal like roots beneath a visible tree. She did it from a corner office on the 14th floor of a building in Cole Harbour in a tailored charcoal suit she had bought without looking at the price tag, which still gave her a small, private jolt of satisfaction. Jasper Soren arrived at her office at 11:40. He did this most days. Under the pretext of reviewing documents, he was entirely capable of reviewing at his own desk. She didn't look up from her screen. The Port Authority wants a meeting on the Annacis Island option. I know. He sat down across from her. He had the afternoon schedule in his hand, which he didn't need because she had already sent it to his phone. The Bellamy assets are still technically in receivership, she said. If we move on the Clark Corridor properties before the creditor filing closes, we can acquire them at about 60 cents on the dollar. I know, he said again. She looked up. He was watching her with the same focused stillness he'd had in that parkade, in the dark, when she hadn't known yet what kind of man he was. She knew now. She'd had 6 months to catalogue every edge of him, the ruthlessness and the fatigue and the particular, careful way he'd built something that looked like armor for so long he'd forgotten there was anything underneath it. She had been good with numbers her entire life. He was the first thing she'd tried to count that kept exceeding the estimate. You're staring, she said. I'm aware, he said. She saved her work, closed the laptop, stood up, and walked around the desk. She straightened his collar, a habit she'd developed without deciding to, the same way she'd developed the habit of leaving a coffee on his desk at 8:15 and reading his moods by the set of his jaw. The woman who locked herself behind an electrical panel, she said quietly, would not recognize this office. No, he agreed, his hand settled at her waist. She thought she was doing quiet, careful work for a company with some questionable freight manifests. She thought she was safe in her smallness. She looked up at him. She was so bored. "I know," he said. For the third time, and this time she heard something in it that wasn't precision. Something warmer and more worn in. Outside the inlet was a slate-blue mirror in the July sun. The city moved below them with its usual indifferent industry, cranes and ferries, and the long, purposeful lines of container ships working the outer harbor. Sasha Birch had grown up in a small apartment in Surrey with second-hand textbooks and a mother who worked 2 jobs and the persistent, bone-deep understanding that the world would not expand to accommodate her unless she made it. She had made it. She pressed one hand flat against Soren's chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of him beneath the expensive fabric, and looked out at the city that was, in every way that mattered, theirs. "The receivership closes Friday," she said. "I know," he said. "You'll have the paperwork to me by Thursday." "Wednesday," she corrected. He almost smiled. She had learned to read the almost, the faint shift at the corner of his mouth, the fractional softening around his eyes. It was, she had decided, worth more than most people's full smiles. "Wednesday," he agreed. The accounts were balanced, the ledgers were clean, and the woman who had once counted other people's money from the outside, who had organized the chaos of other people's lives because she was too afraid to claim her own, she was gone. What remained was considerably harder to underestimate.